I had been to dances before. In the city, they were formal things, with polished floors and women in silk who expected conversation about opera and the quality of the wine. I had stood against those walls, too, though at least in the city I had the excuse of being a student with ink on his cuffs and nothing useful to say about Verdi. The Elkridge Autumn Fair dance was not an opera. Someone had laid pine boards across the church field and strung lanterns from the oak tree to the livery post, and the light they threw was gold and unsteady, catching the dust kicked up by boots that had been walking through cattle bends all afternoon. Billy Ketchum's older brother had brought a fiddle, and a man I did not recognize sat on an overturned crate with a banjo across his knee, tuning it with the careful attention of someone diffusing a small explosive. I stood near Mr. Perkins' cider table with a cup I had not tasted and watched the valley come alive in a way I had not expected. Ranchers I had only seen at a distance, weathered men who nodded once and kept walking, were spinning their wives under the lantern light with a looseness that did not match their Monday faces. Mrs. Crane had stationed herself at the edge of the dance floor like a general surveying a campaign, her gray eyes cataloging every pair, every glance, every hand held a beat too long. Jed Farley had come to the fair, though he stood well back from the dancing with his shapeless hat pulled low and his enormous hands wrapped around a tin cup. He caught my eye across the crowd and raised the cup half an inch, which for Jed was practically an ovation. I was watching him when Clara Dawson walked into the lantern light and the world rearranged itself without my permission. She wore a dress I had never seen, dark blue with a high collar and sleeves that ended in small white cuffs at her wrists. Her hair was pinned up instead of loose under her hat, and it changed the line of her jaw, the way the light caught the curve of her neck. She walked the way she always walked, straight-backed and unhurried, as if the ground owed her something and she was patient enough to wait for it. But the dress softened everything around her, made the lantern glow warmer, the fiddle sweeter, the whole dusty field into something I might have read about in a book and dismissed as exaggeration. I set my cider down and did not pick it up again.
She danced with Billy Ketchum first, which was generous of her and unfortunate for her feet. Billy moved with the enthusiasm of a young horse discovering ice for the first time, all momentum and no steering, and Clara navigated him with the same calm competence she brought to fence posts and wayward cattle. She laughed once when he stepped on her hem, and the sound carried across the field and landed somewhere in my chest where I had not built any defenses. Thomas Dawson stood near the oak tree with Doc Hadley, holding a cup of something that was not cider. He watched Clara dance with the expression of a man counting the last of something precious. I understood that look. I had seen it on my father's face, turned inward, aimed at nothing anyone else could see. Thomas wore it aimed at his daughter, and it made him seem less like the enemy my father had described, and more like a man who knew that time was a thief with excellent taste. I did not dance. I had the skill for it, or had once, but the thought of asking any woman in Elkridge to partner with the Hale boy felt like handing Mrs. Crane a loaded weapon and asking her to please not fire. So I stood with my untouched cider and watched the lanterns sway and told myself I was observing, not longing, which is the kind of lie a man who studied literature should have been too smart to believe.
The dancing slowed after an hour, when the fiddle player's arm gave out and the banjo man switched to something low and wandering. People drifted toward the edges, toward the cider and the cook fires and the darker spaces between the wagons where the lantern light did not reach. I walked to the creek bridge at the south end of the field, the same bridge where Clara and I had stood that morning in a silence I had not been able to stop thinking about since. The creek was loud in the dark, running fast with the last of the autumn rain, and the air smelled of cold water and wood smoke and the faint sweetness of the apple cider someone had spilled near the church steps. I leaned against the railing and breathed and tried to find the version of myself that had come to Elkridge to fix a ranch, not to stand at the edge of a dance watching a woman in a blue dress with the desperate focus of a man studying a sunset he knows will end. I heard her boots on the bridge before I saw her. Clara stopped a few feet from the railing, close enough that I could see the small white cuffs at her wrists and the loose strand of hair that had escaped her pins and fallen against her temple. She did not look surprised to find me there, which meant she had either seen me leave or had come looking, and I did not know which possibility unsettled me more. "You did not dance," she said. "I did not," I said. "That is either very principled or very cowardly, and I have not decided which." Clara leaned against the opposite railing and crossed her arms, and the creek filled the space between us with sound. "I have been told I am occasionally both," I said. Clara almost smiled. I say almost because it started in her eyes and reached one corner of her mouth before she caught it and sent it back where it came from, which was a feat of discipline I found deeply, inconveniently impressive. We stood there. The fiddle had started again inside, something slower, and the lantern light reached the bridge in broken gold patches that moved when the wind swayed the line. I could hear Billy Ketchum laughing somewhere behind the church, and Mrs. Crane's voice rising above the murmur of the crowd, delivering what sounded like a verdict on someone's pie crust.
Clara tilted her head while she listened, leaning it slightly to the left the way she did when something amused her, and a cold thread wound through my chest that had nothing to do with the October air. I had seen that tilt before. Not on Clara. My father, in his delirium, had described a woman to me once without knowing he was speaking aloud. A woman who tilted her head when she listened, who stood with one hand on her hip as if she were waiting for the world to explain itself. He had not said her name, but his voice had carried a tenderness so foreign to the man I knew that I had sat frozen in the dark, afraid to breathe and end it. Clara stood exactly the way my father had described. The tilt of her head, the set of her shoulders, the patience in the way she held still. She looked like someone my father had loved and lost, and the resemblance was so precise that it could not be accident. I did not speak. The thought was too new and too heavy, and if I opened my mouth, I was afraid I would ask her something I was not ready to hear the answer to. So I looked at the creek instead, and let the sound of it drown the question I was not asking. "Emmett," Clara said, and my name in her voice sounded different than it did in anyone else's, as if she had found a way to make it mean something it had not meant before. I looked at her. She looked at me. The lantern light moved across her face, and for a moment neither of us spoke, and the silence was not empty. It was full, packed tight with everything we were not saying, and I understood with perfect clarity that I was standing at the edge of something I could not step back from once I stepped forward. Billy Ketchum's voice shattered the silence like a rock through a window. "Clara, your father is looking for you, and he has the face on." Clara straightened. The almost smile vanished, and something more guarded took its place, something she wore like armor she had practiced putting on quickly. She pushed away from the railing and looked at me one more time, and in that look was an apology and a question, and something else I did not have a word for yet. "Good night, Emmett," she said. "Good night, Clara," I said. She walked back toward the lanterns, and Billy fell in beside her, talking about something I could not hear. I watched her go, the blue dress disappearing into the gold light, and I stayed on the bridge until the cold in my hands matched the cold in the rest of me.
I rode home in the dark with Reverend picking his way carefully along the road, his breath clouding in the moonlight. The valley was silver and black beneath us, the mountains outlined against a sky so full of stars it seemed impossible that any darkness could survive among them. I did not think about the dance. I thought about my father's voice in the dark, gentle, broken, speaking to a woman who was not there. I thought about the book signed M. I thought about the photograph in the desk. 3 young people arm in arm in the summer when everything was possible. And I thought about Clara Dawson, who tilted her head exactly the way my father had described, who stood with the same patience, who carried herself with the same quiet certainty. I had not asked for this, not the ranch, not the father who could not speak his own sorrow, not the neighbor's daughter with her mother's mannerisms and her own sharp mind and a laugh that I had heard once at a fence line and could not stop hearing since. I had come to Elkridge to do one simple thing, to keep my father's land alive until he no longer needed it. But the land had roots, and the roots went deeper than fence posts, and they tangled with other roots beneath the surface in ways I was only beginning to understand. The lamp was burning in the Dawson window when I reached the top of the ridge. I stopped reverent and looked at it for a long time, that small gold glow, no bigger than a fingertip held at arm's length. My father had watched that same light. He had watched it with love and grief so intertwined that even his delirium could not separate them. I turned reverent toward home, and the light stayed behind me, and I carried it anyway.